Welcome everyone to the 2021 South Central Kansas Housing Market Forecast. And we're so glad that everyone could tune in this morning. I'm going to start by turning it over to our 2020 President, Sandy McCray.
Good morning, everybody. And yes, thank you. We're so happy to see that many of you here. We also know that there are some offices out there who are also streaming the event. So I think our attendance is even greater than that. So very happy for that. I'm going to not take any extra time this morning other than to introduce Dr. Stan Longhofer from the Wichita State Center for Real Estate. We have come to really enjoy and look forward to this event each year. We definitely look forward to the forecast, and we love hearing from you, Dr. Stan. This is one of those events that we love to host because I think everybody's sitting on pins and needles, just waiting to hear what you will have to say about 2021, as we all anticipate hopefully a stronger, more positive year from the standpoint of not so crazy next year. So I'd love to hear what you have to say. I'll turn it right over to you, Dr. Stan Longhofer. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Sandy. It is a pleasure to be here with you. I wish we could be together in person. I enjoy it so much more when we get into a dialogue or maybe even a little bit of an argument about some of these things and can interact. There is a Q&A feature in the webinar, and Sheila has agreed to moderate that. So if you have questions in the middle of things, please go ahead and put in those questions. And Sheila, I've told Sheila, jump right in. Interrupt me. I'd really like to make this as much of a discussion as we can. I also, have to apologize just a little bit for some personal reasons. I ended up doing this broadcast from home today, but I was doing it from my office. You would see right over my shoulder here, if you were there last, I guess a week ago, last Friday for the KAR presentation, I just wanted to express my gratitude to all of you for the Citizen of the Year award from last year. That's actually one of the most touching honors that I've received in my time here. Of really, I took it as a statement of gratitude for the work and the partnership that we've had over the last 20 years. And so I have that proudly displayed in my office, and you'd be able to see that if I was there today. But come to my office sometime, see it in person, because I'm very grateful for it. So let me jump back in to the presentation, and hopefully you can see my screen again so that we're all there. And again, this year is the 2021 Kansas Housing Markets Forecast. We do forecasts for all of the major markets across the state, not just Wichita, and I'll chat a little bit about those as we go forward. But as you have questions and things, feel free to visit our website where all of the forecast publications are posted. As always, I have to give a huge thanks to Security First Title and to Ameritrust Credit Union. These beautiful publications that we have that wouldn't be possible if we did not have the generous support of sponsors. And so for the Wichita forecast, Security First and Ameritrust have been longtime sponsors of this, and it's because of them that I'm able to pay my graphic designers, and I'm able to pay for the printing costs so that these are available to you at no charge. And I would encourage you to go by the board office, pick up boxes of them, take them back, use them in listing presentations, relocation packets, however it's most useful for you. They're available because of the generous support that Security First and Ameritrust give us. And then I have to give a big thanks to the Kansas Association of Realtors and all the realtor boards across the state, including the Realtors of South Central Kansas. It's this partnership that we have whereby I have access to your local MLS data. We're able to provide monthly MLS statistical reports, both for the local boards such as RISC, but also for the state of Kansas as a whole. If it weren't for this partnership, we wouldn't have access to the data that's necessary to do this forecast, and you wouldn't have reliable, definitive data about Kansas statewide home sales activity. And so we're grateful for that forecast, for that partnership. So, as you know, every year when I do the forecast, I start as a foundation of looking at what is the labor market like and what is the mortgage market like, because those are the two foundational elements that really drive housing market activity in the coming year. And so I pulled a slide from last year's presentation that I ended a summary of what we saw going forward for the labor market and the mortgage market. And I said at the time, fundamentals were solid. Mortgage financing was historic lows, very cheap and widely available. And then I said that labor markets were fairly healthy. But I finished that with a little bit of a caveat. I said, all of this could change quickly. And it just felt at the time like everything looked so good and felt so good, but was there something kind of hiding over our shoulders that we needed to look out for? Obviously, I had no clue as to what was looming over us and coming forward. And so, the impact and what's happened with the economic environment is absolutely unprecedented. There's no other word to describe it. The greenish line on this chart is the Wichita unemployment rate. And you can see at the peak, we jumped up to an unemployment rate of just about 18% in Wichita. That was immediately after all the shutdowns. Even since then, with the returns and the shutdowns that have moderated somewhat, the Wichita unemployment rate is above 10%, which is higher than it was at its peak following the Great Recession. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but I wanted to highlight the other way we look at the labor market. One is this unemployment rate. And unemployment rate measures households. We call people and we say, do you have a job? Are you actively looking for work? And so forth. And it measures households and where people live. The other way that we measure it is through looking at businesses. This is sometimes called the establishment survey. And so this is the total non-farm employment numbers. And it presents a very similar picture. At the worst back in April and May, we had year-over-year declines in jobs in the Wichita area, dropped by 10%. And even now, when we have the most recent months available, the most recent data we have is August, we're still down total jobs in Wichita more than 5% compared to where we were in August of last year. And so very, very sharp declines. I should make a note on these slides, whenever you see those blue shaded regions, those are reflecting the official dates of recessions as defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And so since the early part of this year, I think it's March is the official start date, we have been in a recession nationwide, and when that will end, we have yet to see. So in looking at this, the Center for Economic Development and Business Research does an annual employment forecast. And Jeremy Hill, for those of you who saw the presentation a couple of weeks ago, made the comment that this is the most difficult time in terms of coming up with any definitive forecast that he's ever had in his professional experience. And in part, it's because there are so many unknowns about what will happen in terms of when will we have a vaccine for the pandemic? Will there be additional waves that will cause further waves of shutdowns? Will there be additional stimulus packages at the federal level that will have an impact on things? As it stands, their forecast right now is that for Wichita employment for the entire year on average of 2020 to be down 4.5% compared to where it was in 2019. And to give some sense of perspective, that's down to a level of 291,000 jobs in the Wichita area, somewhere between where we were back in 2013 and 2014. Next year, they are forecasting a very modest growth up to 293,000 jobs, 0.4%. But that's still back at the level that we were in 2014, or about 7 years of job growth that's been lost. Okay, that's a big challenge, and I'm actually even a little bit more concerned about our labor market situation in the Wichita area. Jeremy's forecast was based off of an assumption that there would be further rounds of stimulus from the federal government. And where that becomes particularly important is through what the federal government does for states. Because unlike the federal government, state governments across the country generally are not able to deficit spend when their revenues decline. And so we have, right now the state revenues have held up okay, but we haven't seen anything since June, and the full impacts of all of the shutdowns and all of the economic stress haven't hit. But it's reasonable to expect that late payroll taxes, income taxes are going to be down significantly as we come through the rest of this year and into next year. You have this level of unemployment, you're going to have significant drops in income taxes. We also should expect that retail sales taxes are going to decline substantially. We've seen that in terms of retail activity, and so that will have an impact on state revenues. And then finally, I think not as much on residential values, but commercial property values could see some meaningful declines as we go into next year, which will impact state revenues from a property tax standpoint in 2021 and 2022 and going forward. And so all of those things are going to put a real pressure on the state finances. And what we fail to understand sometimes about governments is that irrespective of the size of government and what level of spending that we expect from the state government, once that's set, that is a significant part of our economy. And as the state begins to issue cutbacks, whether it's to secondary education or whether it's to other services and things, construction spending on road maintenance and other repairs, things such as that, that is going to have spillover effects into private sector employment. Similarly, we had a really bout of good news here this week with the aviation sector and some of the things with Boeing and the MAX program finally getting approved in Europe and beginning and I think American Airlines announced that they're going to begin some limited flights of the new airliner. But that's a big deal to Wichita because we manufacture so much of the parts of that, and that has an impact on our ability to go forward. But aviation, transportation in terms of just the amount of air travel is severely limiting the demand for commercial airliners, and that has a big impact on us. So these layoffs that we're seeing could be extended and long-term, and that too will have continuing rolling spillover effects. And so I'm worried that we could have, it will take a long time, even if we have the additional federal stimulus, and I didn't mention this, the federal stimulus, what it can do most effectively is help ease the state's budget crisis so the state doesn't have to cut back as much in response to declining revenues. So if the state has cutbacks, if we see continued spillover effects of the job losses that we've seen, that's going to take a long time for us to recover on that. And I think we're going to feel those effects through 2021, even 2022. And it could be several years before we fully recover. Indeed, you just look at the chart that I have in front of you, and you can see that our job level in 2019, we had 305,000 jobs in the Wichita metropolitan area in 2019. In 2008, we had 311,000 jobs. We never fully recovered from that downturn. And I worry that it's going to take us many, many years to recover from this one as well. So I'm going to take a brief pause here and just see, are there any questions related to the labor market situation and jobs before I talk about mortgage markets?
I'm not seeing any questions. So.
Everybody's just kind of shell shocked and a little bit. Sorry, I never like to be the bearer of bad news. I tend to be pretty sanguine about things, but this is a situation that I think we're going to feel the pain for it for quite a while. And as I said, from kind of the day that we started doing all the shutdowns, I was very concerned that the economic damage that was going to happen from all of this was going to be far more severe, even on public health effects. I really appreciated it when our public health director here in Sedgwick County made the statement when in evaluating the shutdown orders. He said, you need to remember, lack of income is a public health issue. And so I think we've done a relatively good job in Kansas of trying to find that balance between being able to allow economic activity to occur versus being able to minimize the spread effects of the pandemic. I did see a question come up. Did you want to follow that one up with us, Sheila?
Yes, Dan, we had a question. What will the effect be on smaller businesses?
You know, that's a hard one to state because smaller businesses are so diverse. There are some businesses that will do very well and will be essentially unaffected. There are other businesses that are completely shut down. And so it really does depend on what your sector is and where you are. It's, you know, one of the concerns that we have on the commercial side, and that's not my focus here today, is, you know, especially with smaller local tenants, landlords are working and trying to work with them to be able, you know, if you can't have customers in, if you can't generate revenue, it's awful hard to pay your rents. The challenge has been a lot of the national tenants have been very, very aggressive in trying to use it as a way to get further concessions, whether they need it or not. And so, again, very different effects depending on your particular business and your segment of the industry. So, labor market, I have concerns going forward. So what's the other side of things? So the other side is mortgage markets. And, you know, again, a year ago, we said mortgage rates are at historic lows. There's no way they can go any lower than this. And every time I make a definitive statement like that, I am proven wrong once again. I tell my students, I only have about 4 jokes. You have me in class a couple times and you hear them all multiple times. But many of you have heard me say, economists were put on the earth to make weather forecasters look good because we get it wrong all the time. And so what happens this year? Mortgage rates drop again to incredibly low levels, below 3% now. Mortgage Bankers Association's forecast is that the 30-year fixed mortgage rate will stay below 3.4% through the end of next year. And I suspect that when they come out with their 2022 forecast sometime next month, that's going to be the case even through 2022. One other thing I wanted to highlight on this particular slide is that you'll notice the green line on the bottom is the 5/1 adjustable rate. So a loan that's fixed for 5 years and then adjusts annually thereafter. And typically that interest rate is lower than the 30-year fixed mortgage rate because it's less risky for lenders. They don't have to worry about that long-term interest rate risk. But what we've seen here ever since the pandemic shutdowns took place is that the 5/1 adjustable rate and the 30-year fixed mortgage rate are just almost in complete lockstep with one another. And that really reflects what is driving this decline in long-term mortgage rates, which is additional renewed purchases of mortgage-backed securities by the Federal Reserve. They've been weaning themselves off of all of those mortgage purchases that happened during the Great Recession. And so we were beginning to see mortgage rates rise a little bit as the Federal Reserve kind of pulled out of that those holdings. And they were doing it very slowly, very measured, so as to not have a really stark impact on housing markets. But when the pandemic began to happen, that was one of the actions that the Fed undertook. And we can see that with the way that 30-year versus 5/1 adjustable rate spread went down to almost nothing. So with that background, what have we seen in housing markets? Well, this is the blue bars on here are the actual home sales reported by your board, the MLS, the Realtors of South Central Kansas. And then the orange line is the moving average to get through the seasonality of sales going up in the spring and down in the fall. And what you can see is that towards the end of 2019, we started to see a little bit of a boost, a little bit of an increase, a very minor drop off in during the shutdowns, and then we basically leveled out. What we're seeing here with this sales activity is that home sales were not impacted on a really big level by the pandemic. A very modest decline in sales in April and really May is where we saw most of the effect. And then that was driven primarily by just some slowdown from some of the brief shutdowns that we had. The driving factor that changes things for this economic downturn compared to the past has been the incredibly tight inventories. And so again, the month supply, all of you know, we measure that as it's a measure of balance in the housing market. And what we do is we take the number of active listings and we divide it by the average pace of sales over the past year. So if there's 1,000 homes available for sale, and we sell on average 200 homes a month, then 1,000 divided by 200 is a 5-month supply. And as you know, we generally think of a balanced market as being one in which we have between a 4 and 6 month supply of homes available for sale. Well, here in the Wichita area, we haven't been down at that level since 2014. We've been in what would be considered a seller's market, at least from a statistical standpoint, for nearly 5 years now. And it's only gotten tighter. We got down to about a little over a 2-month supply last year, and now we're down to about a 1.5-month supply. And it's incredible what you all are doing, continuing to sell homes with nothing out there to sell. Because some of the homes, as you know, that are out there are not really very desirable homes. They're not, we've got the dregs that are left there. And so when you get down to actual homes that people really want to buy, it's the tightest that we've ever seen in history. There's one other thing I want to note on this slide here that's a little bit different, is that you will notice during the shutdowns, there was this spike in the month's supply for the nation as a whole. And that reflects the fact that across the country, many, many markets, real estate activities were forced to shut down. And so sales just ground to a stark halt. That didn't happen in Kansas because Governor Kelly, through a lot of the lobbying efforts of realtors across the state, declared real estate an essential activity. And I think that was so wise. I had a call from at least one state legislature that was kind of asking about it and worried, is this just realtors trying to look out for their own? And I said, no. Imagine if you are somebody who is in a difficult situation because of job losses or needing to move or something else. And now all of a sudden you don't have access to the services of real estate agents. That could be devastating to families and really create a lot of additional hardships. And the risks that there are in terms of spreading from real estate activities are very, very limited because it's not a mass gathering activity. And so the governor very wisely declared real estate essential activity and didn't have the shutdowns. And as we can really see the difference in what happened in Kansas versus what happened nationwide as a result of that. So as you know, not every home is in the same segment of the market. And so one of the things that I try to do is segment by price range. And this is a really gross way of looking at things. I picked some arbitrary price points. I said, let's call the low end of the market homes priced below 100,000. The middle of the market, 100 to 250,000. That's certainly the most popular price ranges. The upper middle, 250 to 500,000. And then the high end of the market is 500,000 and up. Again, purely arbitrary price ranges. But what you can see here is that that most popular price range between 100 and 250 is incredibly low, well below a 1 month supply. That upper middle of the market over the past year has gone from what might have been maybe a balanced market, where we're now down to just barely over a 2 month supply. But what's really striking is that over the past year, even the upper end of the market, homes have sold much more aggressively. And we've seen the month supply go from what was around a 9 month supply a year ago to now down to closer to a 5 month supply now. Very, very striking changes. And so I think what we've seen here is that two things have happened in the housing market that have kept home sales activity very strong. One is that while we have seen very disturbing and great job losses, the job losses thus far have been primarily among households that are less likely to be home buyers. Households that have jobs that can effectively be done remotely are much less likely to have faced job losses thus far, and they're much more likely to be people who are in the purchase market for becoming homeowners. And so we haven't seen demand for homes from the labor market taper off nearly as much as the current job market situation might suggest. In addition, the decline in interest rates has meant that those people who are in a fairly good employment situation all of a sudden now are in a place where, well, you know what, maybe I would have been looking for a $250,000 home in the past, but now maybe I can go for a $300,000 or a more expensive home. People who might have been looking for a $350,000, maybe they're looking for something that's $550,000. I'm going to stretch into something I never dreamed I'd be able to buy in the past, because all of a sudden I can lock in these low interest rates. And if I can get into my forever dream home now, why shouldn't I try and do it? And so that's stretched out and increased demand, especially at some of the more expensive price points from where we've seen. So what is our home sales forecast? Our forecast is that home sales activity will be down ever so slightly this year, but that decline is not due to a lack of demand at this point. It really is due to the lack of inventory. So we're forecasting a very slight decrease this year, with a little bit deeper decrease next year, down 2.4% to a little over 10,500 units. And again, that decline in activity is being driven primarily next year by continuing tight inventories, but also because we expect that the layoffs and the job losses are going to begin to roll into other segments of the economy that are more likely to be a home buying public. It's not going to be a very deep, sharp, distinct drop off in demand, but it will be modest. And so we think that inventory situations will ease a little bit next year as we see demand decline ever so slightly. Still probably be a seller's market next year, but not as nutso as it's been recently. Is that a technical term, nutso? So questions about home sales or comments before I move on with our forecast of home prices and construction?
We do have one. What potential positive effect might we see with more people working from home, potentially wanting to relocate to the Midwest from the East and West Coast to get more affordable cost of living communities?
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation about that and about whether that's going to create some fundamental change. The challenge is, first of all, I think we always need to be very careful about letting exceptional events define what we think will happen going forward. And I'll give an example. Remember following September 11th and the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. And there was a big concern whether or not high-rise office buildings were going to disappear and that they would all go out, and that was, people were not going to be in those. We really didn't see any long-term changes as a result of that. And so I think we have to wait and see how much, work from home and remote activities are going to impact people going forward. Remember that while there are certain things we can do that we've sort of adopted some technologies, it's still a challenge. Some of you are out there and you're having internet connection problems and can't see this. We've all been in Zoom meetings where somebody's audio or video goes out in the middle of it, or somebody's dog starts barking in the background. And those challenges are still going to be frustrating and won't be fixed somehow magically. And then we lose a lot from the interpersonal, informal interactions that we have face to face. And so I really personally believe that there's going to be something of a kickback effect, that when we're all able to be together face to face, we're actually going to really want and long for that and do that more aggressively, perhaps. My wife does some costuming, and one of the things that she points out is that I remember her describing the ladies' evening wear following the end of World War II. If you went through the 1930s and the 1940s, ladies' styles were very austere, and they were, while gorgeous, they used very limited amount of fabric because it was focused on, trying to minimize the cost and the resources that were used in it. You followed that into the 50s and 60s, and I think it was Christian Dior. The effect was these voluminous gowns that had all sorts of fabric in them. It was a response against the austerity that there had been previously. And I think we have to expect that there's going to be some types of effect of that when we come to employment. So with that being said, I just don't think that we're going to see people all of a sudden saying, hey, I can move to Kansas and I don't have to deal with all the things in New York, because part of the reason they live in New York is they like all the garbage they have to deal with. And so I think I think that trend is going to be very modest, and it's going to take a long time for that to really take effect if it does. So, sorry, a longer answer than I should have taken with that, but go ahead. I think there were some other questions.
Yes, we have a few more. Is the decline a direct result of the economy?
I think it's twofold. The decline this year is really just an impact of limited inventories. And again, it's essentially the same thing that I predicted last year. I was stunned when we ended the year last year up 4.2%, because it's just, where are the homes coming from? But so again, this year, it's really just a lack of inventory. Demand remains incredibly strong. I do believe that the economic effects will begin to be more widespread across different segments of the economy next year, and that will contribute to a slight decline in demand. But again, this is not a severe decline in home sales activity. It's just a modest one.
Okay. How does the increase in applications for real estate licensees come into play in your economic forecast?
It doesn't come into play at all. To a certain extent, I don't think that more licensees necessarily stimulates additional sales activity. It doesn't create more sellers out there. It doesn't create more potential buyers. It simply reflects, potential changes in the distribution of the transactions that happen. I've always said, interestingly, one of the things that I've begun telling my students and people in the community when I speak with them here, I've always been a big believer in using a realtor on the seller side of the transaction. And I've always felt that it's not with trying to sell my home quickly or sell it for a high price. Using a realtor is all about making sure that the contract that I have actually closes, because there's so much that could happen that could derail the deal. And most of us out there have no clue of the 50 billion steps of things that have to happen to make that deal work. Good realtors work that and they make it happen. And so I always say you want somebody who's very experienced. You want somebody that can help you through that. From a buyer's perspective right now, however, in the past I've said, if you like, working with somebody, great. I think there's value in adding, creating a buyer agency agreement with somebody. But if not, okay, you can get away with that. Right now, if you're trying to buy a home, I don't see how you find something if you're not working with a realtor who can see the homes as they're about to be put on the market, so that you can get in very quickly. All that being said, you know, if I'm a practicing realtor, if I'm successful, I'm not too worried about additional licensees coming into the market, because my value comes from my experience and the value that I can add to that transaction. And so,
couple more questions.
yeah.
Does the market as you see it change as you move farther above 500,000 to 750,000 and above threshold?
Yeah, you certainly, you know, I picked some arbitrary thresholds here. And if we picked some different thresholds, 750 up or 1,000,000 and up, you will see differences. I'm not going to speak too detailed on those. Again, it's one of the points that I make to people is that I can forecast averages, and I look at you know, I fly over at 40,000 feet and predict these statistics, but nobody owns the average Wichita home. And so while my numbers are good for the market as a whole, they really don't tell you much individually about your home in your neighborhood, in your location within the neighborhood. And again, that's where a qualified and experienced realtor can really help you with that. There are differences, and it can change from month to month. And so I really don't try and get into those details. What's been interesting is just that at that upper end of the market, you know, a year ago, we were really saying it was a tale of two markets. We have kind of the modest price ranges and the upper end, and the upper end was still struggling. And I do think we're seeing much greater demand in that upper end than we've seen in a long time.
And then this relates to your small business discussion a little while ago. Are independent contractors counted individually as individual businesses?
Yes, independent contractors are counted individually as businesses. There are estimates that go into all of those pieces, because independent contractors are, you know, we get information of these things from tax returns. And so it does depend a little bit on other, you know, do you have another job elsewhere and so forth. But yes, when you see those tallies, independent contractors are essentially sole proprietorships.
Okay, great. Those are my questions for now.
Well, as you can imagine, if we've got demand that, again, among home buyers, demand is still very strong, and we have very limited inventories, home price appreciation should be pretty healthy. And we are forecasting the strongest home price appreciation for Wichita this year that I can remember in going back, you know, 20, 30 years. So 6.6% is really aggressive home price appreciation for Wichita, and another 5.6% next year, even as we're forecasting some softening of demand. And that's because inventories are so tight. So we think home price appreciation is going to continue at an extremely healthy clip. And what that then ends up doing for us is new home building permits. If you've listened to my presentations over the past several years, I've said, well, you'd expect with strong demand, tight inventories, new home construction would begin to pick up. Well, again, the teal bars on here are building permits reported by the Wichita Area Builders Association every month since 2003. And then the orange line is the moving average here. And what we had is that permits were sitting around 80, 85 permits a month, about 1,000 permits a year from 2013 through 2019. We just never budged. And the reason that we weren't seeing permitting activity pick up at all was because from 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, home price appreciation of existing homes in the Wichita market was essentially bouncing around zero. We'd have a year that was positive, maybe 0.5%, and then we'd have a year that was negative, maybe 1%, but no great declines like we saw nationwide, but we didn't see any existing home price appreciation. And so as a result, through all of those years, construction costs continued to go up. Labor costs got higher, materials got higher, but existing home prices were remaining flat. And so as a result, it became harder and harder and harder for new homes to compete with existing homes. But over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen more stronger appreciation in the existing home market. And that's finally beginning to have an impact. And builders are able to build at some more modest price points. And you can see here over the past year, we've seen that trend line really start to go up. And so we're forecasting next year that a really strong increase in new home construction activity up to a little over 1,200 units, a 12.5% increase. And even next year in 2021, we're forecasting a slight decline. But you'll notice that 1,125 units that we're forecasting, that's the strongest number we've seen, I think, since 2009. And so it's a really, really strong. You know, we've been struggling to get above that 1,000 units per year, and now we're up 1,100, 1,200 units. So that's a healthy increase, and I think that's a good point. Part of the reason we're seeing the increase in construction activity is also, I think, because of these low interest rates and buyers who maybe thought, oh, you know, I can't really go into the new home. It's a little too expensive for me. They're saying, wow, if I can take advantage of these low interest rates and get my forever home, build my dream home in a way that I never thought was possible because of these low interest rates, now I can. I want to take advantage of that. So that all is creating some really strong demand in the new home construction side. Well, that's our forecast. Again, slight decline in home sales activity next year, especially as the unemployment effects begin to spread into other segments of the economy. Permitting activity will increase strongly this year, but down just a little bit next year, but still the second strongest year in over a decade. And home price appreciation incredibly strong. And so we obviously have our forecasts for the state and for all the other markets across the state. I always want to give thanks to Security First and Meritrust for their support. And with that, I'll take other questions that you have.
Okay, I have one out there right now. Does this include multifamily permits when you were talking about the permit numbers?
No, that's a really great question. I do not separately forecast multifamily. This is entirely single family units. And one area where that becomes really interesting, obviously we've got a lot of apartment construction going on, and the high-end apartments are part of what's sort of been able to offset some of this demand at the upper end for new homes and purchases. Some people are choosing that luxury apartment living, but we also haven't included some of those higher end duplexes that have been built as rentals in recent years.
Okay. I also had a question for you. When you talk about appreciation, do you sense that that is a temporary adjustment because of low inventory, or do you sense that it's because of ongoing undervalued homes in the Midwest that are just finally getting to be where they're valued where they're supposed to be?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. My personal feeling is that we've gotten a little bit spoiled with incredibly inexpensive housing here. And, you know, the value of housing ultimately, kind of long term, has to reflect two things. Number one is the depreciated cost of construction. So if it's a new home, you know, you don't have any depreciation, it's the cost of construction. But older homes do have some depreciation, both functional and physical and economic, you know, obsolescence that come together that reduce the value of the home below its construction cost new. That's normal. And then you add in the land value. Our land values are incredibly cheap, and that's always going to keep our home prices very affordable compared to what you would see in some of the coastal markets. But our underlying home price appreciation has not kept up in recent years with the increase in construction costs. And so I have felt like we really needed to see some more stronger, healthier home price appreciation. And I do not see our home prices declining somehow once the inventory situations start to become more balanced. Instead, my expectation is that we'll see home price appreciation moderate down to a more typical level, maybe that 2.5%, 3.5%, maybe 4% range, but not these high 5 to 6% range that we've been in the last couple of years.
Okay, another question. How do you see the increasing lumber prices affecting new construction? Will we see higher new home prices?
Obviously, materials are a fundamental piece. Labor is a big piece of new home construction costs, but when you add it all up, it's not like a 50% increase and I don't remember the exact numbers for the lumber costs, but a huge increase in lumber package isn't going to translate into that same percentage increase because it's only one component of all of those. I would also note that those tend to be pretty volatile over time. And so sometimes you'll see a big increase and it'll spike up, and other times you'll see a decline. And some of that just depends on how does somebody like Star Lumber manage their inventory risk in terms of locking in prices going forward. Some of it is how do home builders lock in their costs and how much do they have to pass on. So it will have an impact, but I don't think it's going to be, this is nothing new. We've been seeing these kind of material costs go up for over a decade now.
Okay, and also relating to the lumber pricing, is that reflected in the forecast for new construction sales?
The short answer is yes, but there's nothing specific that we're building into that. I'm not projecting that there is somehow a big decline in new home construction just because of those lumber costs. I think it's really driven more by overall costs and demand on that side. And again, it's really been more than the construction cost increases right now have been more than offset by the decline in mortgage rates, which makes it much easier for people to afford and stretch into a new home if they want to.
Okay, another question for you. There seems to be a trend of a lot more renters. Might you predict a swing from renters to buyers in the future? If so, what may be the catalyst?
You know, it's really interesting to see how we change in home ownership preferences. You know, prior going into the financial crisis, we had seen home ownership rates nationwide top out at historically high levels, and then they dropped off pretty substantially in the wake of that. I actually think that there's a healthy balance in terms of home ownership. Home ownership's a wonderful thing. It's a great way to build wealth, and it's great for our communities and for building stability. But not everybody should be a homeowner. And whenever people ask me, is now a good time to buy a home? I always tell them, well, it depends on you. Is it a good time for you? If you are financially stable, your job situation is good, and you are in a position where you're able to make the down payment and afford the closing costs and have sufficient reserves where you're able to assume the responsibilities of home ownership, that's one piece of it. And then second, are you locationally stable? Are you likely to stay in the same community and in the same house for an extended period of time? Because the best way to lose money in the real estate market is to sell frequently. I'm sorry, I know that's a terrible thing to tell realtors, but if somebody is a serially home buyer and seller, they are going to do terrible on their real estate investment. If they move every 2 years, financially speaking, they ought to be renting. Whether it's renting a single family home or renting an apartment, you need to have that stability of your location in order to make home buying make financial sense as a personal investment. I mean, if those are true, then you should. I think that there was a change where we had an attitude almost in the early 2000s that everybody needs to own, everybody needs to own. And I think we're a little more balanced there. And I think that's healthy for both the housing market and for individual personal finances as well. How will that change? How will people's perceptions about owning versus renting change? There is a generational effect. As millennials move from being sort of young singles and young couples, the dinks, as we used to call them, dual income, no kids, and they move more into the family stage, people tend to want their own house, their own yard. And so that has an impact. But what's been really interesting and kind of neat, I think, in the wake of the housing crisis is that we've seen rental properties expand into segments of the single family market that never used to be rental properties in the past. And I think that's actually a healthy thing, that if somebody can go and rent a $300,000 home because they're in that situation and be in a really nice, stable, owner-occupied neighborhood, but since they're on a corporate relocation track and they may move in 2 years, renting makes more sense. I think that's a healthy thing.
Okay. Another question. What will make sellers feel more comfortable putting their homes on the market since their home values are now high? Why not list now?
Oh, well, that's a really great question. And by the way, I just want to say, I know we're over time, but I hope you're finding this valuable. And so I'll stay here as long as people want. So the question was about sellers feeling more comfortable. It is interesting. We began when the whole COVID crisis began. Karen Gailey from the Kansas Association asked us, hey, can we see kind of what's happening? And we began tracking new listing activity and contracts being written on a daily basis to try and see what was happening. And the place where we saw the biggest impact immediately was in new listings, people who were putting their home on the market for the first time. That dropped off far more sharply than did new contracts being written and closings that were occurring. And I think what that reflected was potential sellers who were saying, if I don't have to sell, I don't want these strange people walking in, bringing all this icky virus into my house. And so they just said, I won't sell. So that had an impact. I think that's moderating. I think people are feeling a little bit more comfortable with where the balances are, how you can navigate it. You all have done a fantastic job of educating potential sellers and helping them understand how you're going to respect their health and safety. And so I think that's been dealt with partially. The second issue you have with sellers is the one that you all have been talking about for a long time. People who are afraid their home is going to sell too quickly, and where do I move? And unfortunately, there's just not a good solution for that other than kind of getting that market churning and getting them buying a house or being willing to move into a rental for a period of time in order to facilitate that transaction.
Right. And we have one question out there to kind of wrap it up possibly. Looking at the forecast in total, how does Wichita compare to the rest of the state?
Wichita is very similar to the rest of the state. Almost the entire state looks very, very similar. The one exception in the last couple of years has been Manhattan. Manhattan had been a little weaker the last couple of years and really kind of tracking behind everybody else. And then this last year, they've just taken off and they have the strongest increases in home sales activity that we're seeing across the state. But Wichita, from a statewide standpoint, let me resume my share here and I can kind of show you what the statewide forecast is here. So get up to that. And you can see our forecast statewide is a very modest increase. Again, basically flat home sales activity this year with a slight decline next year. Single family building permits, pretty strong increases. Kansas City has really benefited from this home price appreciation, making new home construction more competitive. And so that's Kansas City area is really driving the increase in permitting activity next year. And then Wichita's home price appreciation is the strongest in the state right now, even stronger than Kansas City. And so that's, again, very healthy. And you can, again, see the other markets across the state. Well, I thank you so much. I've enjoyed our time together. I'm looking forward so much when we can be together face to face. Once again, want to thank Security First and Meritrust for your sponsorship. Please go pick up the booklets. I know Alvina would love to have them not out there in front of her desk. So take advantage of these, make use of them. And then, I have one last request that I want to make of all of you. I will be posting the video of today's presentation on the Center for Real Estate website and our YouTube channel later today. Our YouTube channel, if you go to search for WSU Real Estate, you'll find it. And when you're there, please, please, please subscribe to our channel. I'm only 11 subscribers short of being able to get a custom URL in YouTube. And we'd really like to do that. Even if you want to unsubscribe later, you can. But if you subscribe today, put us in there, then we'll get that custom URL. And that just helps make things cleaner and easier to explain to people if they're trying to find us in the future. So with that, I'll stop my share again and turn it back over to you, Sandy. Any last comments?
No, I just want to thank you once again. We always, like I said, we always look forward to this forecast each year. And I think it's just looks like a very, very healthy, strong look and forecast into the new year. So thank you again for being here with us today. We appreciate you spending your time and doing this with us each year.
Well, thank you all.
Sheila, any final comments?
No, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for the information, Stan. That's great.
You all have a wonderful rest of your year. We'll see you later.